Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, 2020 Thor continues. With this, it's the Mighty Thor Epic Collection, Even An Immortal Can Die. This is the 9th Epic Collection, which has stories from the late 1970s. This has stories from 1977 to 1979. And this is a really interesting period in Thor. Len Wein, who is writing the book, ends his run on Thor as a writer, and Roy Thomas takes over. The great Roy Thomas, who wrote everything in comic books and probably is best known for bringing Conan into Marvel Comics and writing Conan forever. He wrote over 100 issues of Conan for Marvel, and he was just magnificent on that. So Roy Thomas takes over Thor, which is interesting because Roy Thomas was really interested in the Norse myths and mythology in general, and he tried his level best to bring in as much mythology as possible into the Thor comic book. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work so much, in my opinion, but it was always interesting and entertaining. And these stories at this particular time had a really epic scope, which is good for Thor. But probably the most interesting thing about these issues is the artwork. Because here in these issues, we get Walter Simonson, the great Thor artist, Walter Simonson. This is his first time on Thor in the 1970s. We know him best for his incredible run on Thor in the 1980s. His Thor comics in the 1980s, they're a masterpiece. Possibly the greatest run on Thor ever. I would say it definitely would be if it wasn't for Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I still prefer Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, but that might change because I'm about to read, in my reading of Thor, I am reading every issue of Thor from the early 1960s into the mid-90s when the first run of Thor ended. I'm at the point where I'm reading the last few issues before Walt Simonson begins that legendary run. So maybe my opinion will change, and I will think Walt Simonson's run is the best ever, because it definitely was an amazing run. In this epic collection, we get the beginning of Walt Simonson on Thor. Here we have issue 260, and we get the artist, Walt Simonson, and he's inked by Tony DeZuniga. Every time Tony DeZuniga inks anything, it all looks very Tony DeZuniga. But that is Walt Simonson art. You could be forgiven for not recognizing it right away because his style was very different at this time in the 1970s. It was very, very good, though. And these are just beautifully drawn comic books. This storyline starts off in space, but we have all of our Asgardian characters out in space, and it's just wonderful work. Walt Simonson's artwork at this point seems, well, it is epic in scope. We have to give it that. There's Thor and the Lady Sif, his beloved Lady Sif. His style seems more reminiscent of John Buscema at this point, with a lot of Jack Kirby thrown in, if I had to compare it to anybody. It doesn't look so much like the artwork he does later, but you do see some of that in some of these epic scenes. This particular storyline really showcases Walt Simonson's strengths. I mean, it's just epic and incredible. And look at that great splash page. That one's inked by Ernie Chan. It's just amazing stuff. I want to go ahead, though. Look at this great scene of Loki. Yeah, there's Loki, the evil Loki. That's awesome. Walter Simonson really knew how to draw a splash page. But I'm going to flip ahead. It's the Destroyer. I'm going to flip ahead to the return of the Destroyer. The Destroyer, a being created by Odin eons ago to fight against a shadowy menace that will appear in the future. He is an unbeatable, indestructible being, and he frequently just shows up and fights Thor. And this is his, I think, up to this point, I think it's his greatest appearance. Because in this next issue, issue 265, When Falls the God of Thunder, we get Walt Simonson inking himself. So all of the artwork in this particular issue is done by Walt Simonson. So we can get a really good look at his style at this point in his career. And it's just beautiful. And he gets to draw Galactus there. We get to throw in Galactus and the Fantastic Four. And we get an incredible battle with the Destroyer. I mean, this is absolutely the best fight with the Destroyer up to this point. And we get a really good look at Walt Simonson doing all of the artwork with these really clean lines, and the action just flows incredibly, and it's epic. Just look at that. It's just brilliant stuff. I mean, the way he draws the characters, it made me wish when I read this that he just was able to ink himself on every issue. Unfortunately, he wasn't. Because, I mean, it just looks amazing, this whole issue. It's just brilliant stuff. I mean, look at that. Great. Just great. And Thor is having a rough battle. I mean, this is a tough fight. It's just amazing stuff. And so in the next issue, Tony DeZuniga returns, and we finish up that battle with the Destroyer. Just great stuff. Ha! And then Odin returns, and the Destroyer kneels to Odin. I mean, just look at that. It's so cool. So Walt Simonson, in his first run on Thor, is just great. Then we are interrupted by a king-size annual. This has a couple of annuals. This epic collection does, and in this particular one, we have the Guardians of the Galaxy, the original Guardians of the Galaxy, not those Guardians from the movies. This has artwork by Sal Buscema and Klaus Johnson. It's not bad, but compared to the stuff we've just been reading, it's not nearly that great. So we'll flip ahead and return to Walt Simonson and Tony DeZuniga and Len Wein. And in this story, Asgard is being repaired. Look at that. I mean, Simonson's just so great, even in these early Thor issues. It was kind of a high point because he is just such a great artist. So we have Thor, and he's on the Rainbow Bridge there. Now, Thor is at this point going back to Earth. But, you know, on Earth, he turns into, when he feels like it, he could turn into the lame Dr. Blake, his mortal identity. Dr. Blake, who is not my favorite part of the Thor comic book, and is actually frequently forgotten. It's very often you will have Thor go out on Thor adventures, and the whole Dr. Donald Blake identity just gets forgotten for months, and you just don't see him forever. And at this point, he shows up back on Earth, and he's been gone so long that when Dr. Blake shows up to his doctor's office, it's been replaced by a parking garage. Whatever life Don Blake has, it's always being screwed up by Thor. This, unfortunately, becomes an issue in future Thor comic books. I never think Thor's comic book adventures on Earth where he's just basically a superhero, are as entertaining as his Asgardian adventures. He ends up fighting villains like Damocles. Who is this? Damocles. He fights Damocles here. A villain so forgettable. I mean, I wouldn't even remember who he was if it wasn't for him saying his name. But he has to fight the forgettable Damocles. But the artwork is good because Walt Simonson does it. Here we have Thor reading a newspaper. And he's still on Earth, so he has to fight the incredible Stiltman. Yeah, everybody's favorite villain, Stiltman. Thor fights Stiltman. He fights Blastar. Blastar shows up and he fights Blastar. And that's actually a pretty good fight. So, pretty good issue. And at this point, Len Wein, with his Blastar stories, is coming to the end of his adventures. We get this final bit where Thor teams up with Iron Man. So that's kind of fun. It's always fun when Thor teams up with Iron Man. But this team up with Iron Man is actually the last story that Walter Simonson does for the regular Thor comic book. And he goes out with a bang. Look at that. That's Walter Simonson's final image for Thor. And it sucks that he left because he was just amazing. But what he did in the 1980s is, of course, legendary. So he did come back to Thor for that. But his run in the 70s was actually really, really good. It was really good stuff. I was sorry to see him leave, but we did get John Buscema showing up. And this is the first Roy Thomas issue. This is 272. We get John Buscema, one of my favorite Thor artists. He's just one of my favorite comic book artists of all time. He is inked by Tom Palmer, and Tom Palmer is not my favorite inker for John Buscema. He's not terrible, but he's not my favorite. Very often he makes the faces look a little wonky, in my opinion. But, you know, it's good stuff. And with this issue, Roy Thomas has arrived, and he's going to start putting a bunch of mythology into the Thor comic book. Very shortly, Dr. Donald Blake will be completely forgotten. But while on Earth, Thor runs into this newsman that he knew before in the Jack Kirby run. This is Harris Hobbs. And Harris Hobbs wants to do a television special. And he wants to do it in Asgard. He wants to take a news team with a cameraman and everything to Asgard and film a special, a television special. And Thor basically tells him he's nuts. There's not a chance in the world that that's going to happen. But, you know, it does, because the Midgard serpent shows up. Now, this is always bad news, because this is the Midgard serpent showing up. That's always something that could, you know, come before Ragnarok. Ragnarok, which is the destruction of the gods and Asgard and everything, which has been foretold. Ragnarok is going to happen eventually. And we get a lot of, like, false alarms for Ragnarok in the Thor comic book. But in these issues, it seems like, is Ragnarok really going to happen? Because there's the Midgard serpent, and Thor has to fight the Midgard serpent. Meanwhile, Loki, being mischievous, has, you know, made a deal with the news team, and he snuck this news team up to Asgard. So there are mortals in Asgard who want to film a television special. Thanks, Loki. So he did that. But Loki has bigger plans, because here he is bragging that Ragnarok is about to happen. Everything is coming into place, and we're actually going to get Ragnarok. So Roy Thomas is starting his run with a bang. He's starting with Ragnarok. And also at this point, Roy Thomas makes Odin lose an eye, because when he took over the comic book, Odin had 2 eyes, and he's like, that's not right. Odin needs to be 1 eye to Odin, and so he makes sure that Odin loses his eye right away. Odin has to go get some knowledge, and it costs him an eye, which causes some confusion in the future adventures of Thor, because in the Thor comic book, because sometimes you get flashbacks to Asgard in the past, and Odin has only 1 eye, when in fact at the time in the Marvel Universe he had 2. It's all very confusing, but Roy Thomas couldn't stand that Odin had 2 eyes, so he took care of that in this memorable scene right there. So things are coming to pass that it looks like Ragnarok could happen. Now, one of the things that apparently has to happen for Ragnarok to happen is Balder the Brave has to be killed. But Balder the Brave can't be killed. Here's Balder, and he's bragging about how he can't be killed. Throw all the spears and arrows you want at me. You know what? You can't hurt me. I'm Balder. I have an enchantment which prevents me from getting killed. I don't have to worry about nothing. I don't have to... Uh-oh. Oh, no. Even an immortal can die. So that sucks for Balder and actually all of us, because doesn't this mean that Ragnarok could happen? Oh, yes, it does. Balder is dead. Now truly Asgard and all the earth must face the day of doom, the day called Ragnarok. Yep, Ragnarok is on its way. Balder's up and got himself killed. Don't worry, he's not really dead. Here we have all the terrible stuff that's going to happen, you know, drawn by John Buscema. It's awesome. He's not really dead. He's hovering between life and death, apparently. So to keep him from totally dying, Odin is going to put him in a suspended state, which is going to cost him a lot of his power. And so there we have Balder hovering between life and death. So long as the mystic Odin shield surrounds Balder true, just so long shall Asgard stand. If it fades or Odin falls, Balder dies the death from which there is no reprieve. And Loki, damned Loki, shall win after all. So, pretty tense. Must keep Balder alive, but this is going to take a lot of Odin's energy. He's using all his energy to keep Balder alive. In the meantime, some other stuff is happening. There's a cameraman, this guy, who's been hitting on Lady Sif, which is never a good idea. And Loki is going to take advantage of this. And Loki decides to turn, using magic, he's going to turn this guy, this cameraman, into an alternate version of Thor. So we get a second Thor. And I think Roy Thomas did this because he wanted to put into the comic book a Thor character who looked more like the Thor from mythology. You know, he's all about mythology, Roy Thomas, and the Thor comics. So we get this alternate version of Thor, who decides he's going to be the new Thor, and he goes and fights Thor, and he takes Thor's hammer. He just takes Thor's hammer, even though he's, you know, completely unworthy. But, you know, magic. So he takes Thor's hammer and then just kicks Thor's ass, which doesn't seem right, but he does. In all of this, one of the news team gets killed. One of the mortals in Asgard gets killed. And so, you know, things are just going to hell. Speaking of, there's Hela. Hela shows up. I was interrupted, sorry. Anyway, I was interrupted right at the high point of the story where Thor takes up the sword since his hammer is gone, and they fight back for Asgard. For Asgard. Look at that. That's just awesome. And in the end, at long last, Ragnarok. But Ragnarok does not destroy everything, as you would expect, because this version of Ragnarok isn't a complete, it's not the complete Ragnarok. Thor takes his hammer back, or gets his hammer back from the other Thor, fights off the Midgard serpent. The other Thor turns back to his old self and dies. It's tough to be a newsman in Asgard. Things don't usually go well for you. And that's that. And it turns out that the whole thing has been kind of manipulated by Odin to take place in just this way so that Ragnarok doesn't destroy everything. We also get a really cool king-size annual, number 7, which has a story about the Eternals. This is illustrated by Walt Simonson and Ernie Chan, so this is the last Thor artwork by Walt Simonson for a while. But this is an interesting story because Roy Thomas brings back Jack Kirby's The Eternals and tries to fit in. This is the beginning of a whole saga that is to come with the Eternals, where Roy Thomas tries to fit in the mythology as presented in the Eternals as it is presented in Thor. It's pretty epic, actually, in scope, and it's a really interesting story. And that story actually begins in this annual here. And the artwork is just so cool. Such good stuff. Such good stuff. I mean, look at that. It's great. So Walt Simonson came back for that. This comic ends up with a couple interesting things. For one thing, we have an issue that's illustrated by classic Silver Age Superman artist Wayne Boring. Wayne Boring shows up from the classic Silver Age Superman to draw an issue of Thor, which isn't the greatest issue in the world. And unfortunately, Wayne Boring lives up to his name in this particular issue. Unfortunately. But we do get a really interesting Thor story at the end from Marvel Preview Presents, number 10. This was a black and white comic. Thor showed up in a few black and white comics. We get Thor the Mighty, which was a really good story that takes place in the past, it's a black and white comic, so it's more mature. It's more mature. But really cool story. Takes place in the past, so Odin has both his eyes. It's more mature, you see. So there's Thor about to get it on with that lady. Doesn't happen though. He's interrupted. It's not that mature. He has to fight off some monsters. But it's a really cool story. And the artwork is by Jim Starlin and Tony DeZuniga. Cool black and white story. I wish there were more Thor black and white stories from back in the day, because the ones that they have are pretty cool. We also get a Hercules story at the end with artwork by Val Mayerick, who did a lot of horror comic books, and he was pretty good at that. And he does a good job in this Hercules story. So this Hercules story is just like this extra thing we have in this epic collection, and you can see why he was good at horror comic books from that scene with Medusa there. That was pretty awesome. But that wraps up this epic collection. And this was a really interesting time on Thor, mostly because I think Walt Simonson just did that great work. But we move on to the Eternals saga by Roy Thomas. And that is a really interesting story, but the epic collection for that hasn't been released yet, unfortunately. But yeah, I'll shut up now because I've gone on forever. I will catch you next time.